The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Massimo Faggioli on the intersection of faith and politics for America's second Catholic president. James Traub on how restoring democratic principles in domestic policy can restore America's legitimacy as a world leader. Plus, Bill Press with Norm Ornstein on how to break through GOP obstructionism and advance on Biden's agenda. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. In his recent and timely book, historian and theologian Massimo Faggioli provides an insightful overview of Catholicism in U.S. politics and its place in the career of President Biden. He says Biden's public embrace of his faith offers a much-needed opening to heal the division of the last 4 years. And we say hello to Massimo Faggioli, a professor of theology and religious studies at Villanova University. He's also the author, most recently, of Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States. Massimo Faggioli, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. You've written about how President Biden's faith was a key element in his political campaign. How do you understand his choice to do that?
Well, because I think he learned from history, from the recent history of the election of 2016, but also I think from a few problems that another Catholic candidate for the Democrats faced, John Kerry, in 2004. And what was interesting is that Joe Biden's approach to the issue was new. It was unprecedented because all Catholic candidates before him, Al Smith, 1928, John Kennedy, 1960, and John Kerry, 2004, they had or chose to keep their Catholic identity a bit at a distance. For different reasons, in 28, in 1960, and 2004. So here Joe Biden embraced that. And it was, I think, very interesting because it allowed him to reach out to certain parts of the country that are not necessarily liberal, but that can connect with that kind of experience and of language.
And perhaps not even necessarily Catholic, but Christians in general, I would think that given what we just came from in the previous 4 years versus where he is and his well-known belief in the faith.
Absolutely. So here, of course, in the United States, there's a separation, church and state, but there's really no separation between religion and politics. And what we have seen under Donald Trump was a cynical manipulation of the language, but also of the symbols of the place of faith and of Christianity especially. So here Joe Biden has understood that there had to be a certain kind of correction that could be done in terms that are familiar to those who have a religious background, experience, or a spiritual quest. And so that's why I believe the election of a Catholic candidate like Joe Biden says something on the deepest needs to restore something that was damaged in these last 4 years.
Looking at Joe Biden's career in politics, how do we see his faith influencing actual public policy?
Well, certainly it's a faith that has shaped his language on the effort to pass the reform of healthcare with President Obama. So what's typical of the Catholic worldview is this concept of the common good, and healthcare and universal access to healthcare is a key tenet of the Catholic social view. And of course, that's why Joe Biden was one of the links between the administration and Catholic healthcare that was in favor of that, with the opposition of US bishops, we know. And so that's one of those moments. And I believe what we have seen lately is dealing with the pandemic. So that has reignited a few spiritual phenomena. I mean, anxieties and needs. And so as a Catholic, he's articulating that with his own symbolism, but in an inclusive way, not in a confessional way, not in a proselytizing way, but very comfortable, very easygoing, I would say, in a positive sense.
You know, one of the issues that you explore in the book is how the state of American Catholicism is different than when the only other Catholic president, John F. Kennedy, held office. And you sort of alluded to this earlier. How is the Catholic community different now, and what kind of political impact might that have on the Biden presidency?
In 1960, Catholicism was still coming of age, socially, culturally, economically, and politically. And so for John Kennedy, the problem was being accepted as a Catholic from the liberal and Protestant mainstream in 1960. For Joe Biden, the problem for his Catholicism is not being accepted by liberals or by Protestants, but by fellow Catholics. So the biggest difference is that US Catholicism is now much, much more divided internally than it was 60 years ago, in a very dangerous way. So not just on social political issues, but also on theological ones. So there's a big rift within US Catholicism about Pope Francis, so which is unprecedented, because if there's one thing that historically has united all Catholics in this country was a certain very militant allegiance to the Pope. This is not true for Pope Francis. And so it's a more divided church. And this is a problem for Joe Biden, because every community in this country is divided, but it can also be an advantage because the major opponents of his election and of his presidency, the US bishops, do not really enjoy much support of fellow Catholics. And so this is one problem he doesn't have.
As you delve into that topic of the relationship between President Biden and Pope Francis, from a political point of view, what's the importance of the relationship between the White House and the Vatican?
It's historically important because having the Pope as a friend cannot really give much advantage. It is certainly disadvantageous to have an enemy in the Vatican. And so we have seen this has been, I believe, one of the factors of Donald Trump's demise, that he openly challenged the very basic dignity and authority of the papacy and of the Catholic Church. And so here Joe Biden doesn't need to do too much, because the Vatican, we know that the Vatican is very happy about Joe Biden being elected president. Is really looking forward to the restoration of normal, cordial relationships. So here there is a convergence on some policy issues, especially number one, it's the environment, and then migration and refugees, more generally multilateralism, which is an article of faith in some sense of the Vatican diplomacy. But again, the Vatican is already operating in a world that is in some sense post-American, but at the same time, the Vatican knows that nothing big can be accomplished in the world without America. And so this is really part of the Vatican perception of this moment and of the importance of the presidency of Joe Biden.
We're speaking with Massimo Faggioli, professor of theology and religious studies at Villanova University, also the author most recently of Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States. Massimo, what are some of the other specific issues that you anticipate Pope Francis will have in common with the president?
I think that one of the big items on the agenda of Pope Francis is the reconciliation in the world, in the one human family, as he calls it, with Islam. And so from a diplomatic point of view, there's a big issue with Iran. So it's one of the wishes of the Vatican that there is peace in that region, and therefore a new deal with Iran for denuclearization. Pope Francis is traveling at the end of this week to Iraq, which has been a proxy for the wars between Iran and the United States and the Allies. So this is going to be a very big part of that. And of course, the two Koreas, and of course, China. And so there are many areas where there is a convergence in the interest of peace. So one area where there is, I believe, a natural difference of perception is about the future of Latin America, because Pope Francis, as an Argentinian, has a perception of the Americas that tend to be different from Washington's. So here there is a natural convergence on some global issues and natural divergences on some other issues. But again, what happens in the 20th century is the creation of this alliance between Washington and the Vatican. And this is something that it's imaginable to abrogate or to work without. That's why these last 4 years with Donald Trump was very difficult for the Vatican, because it was a very unnatural situation.
The last 4 years were difficult for a lot of people with Donald Trump, but that's another story for another time. The Vatican and President, though, will differ on at least one issue, and that is abortion. How much of a political problem can this be for President Biden?
It's a political problem domestically, for sure. Historically, that's one of the issues on which the Vatican and the popes, they do not use that issue to impede or obstruct dialogue. And so that issue is usually given to local bishops. The Vatican has other issues on the agenda. And so it was interesting, for example, to read an interview that was published yesterday in Italy with former Pope Benedict XVI, who said Joe Biden is a good believer, is a good Catholic, and on abortion we differ, but that is, after all, the platform of the party. And so that was very interesting, because you can see that a conservative Catholic like Pope Benedict is using a very different language about Joe Biden than the one used by US bishops. And so here there's a certain pragmatism of the Vatican always that stands firm on Catholic teaching, on abortion, but at the same time is not willing to use that issue to jeopardize the whole collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Now, something else, healing. It's a word we hear about a lot right now in the public square, healing from the COVID pandemic, healing from deepening, at times, violent political division. How can President Biden's faith serve him on this issue of healing?
So I believe it serves him on two levels, at least. One is because in Joe Biden's life, we know, because he told us, that faith has helped him survive, literally, the many griefs he has gone through. And so it's something he has lived. It's not something that he's just preaching. So, and it's something that you can see. It's very hard to say Joe Biden is not Catholic. It's a stretch. It's not believable. Second, it's that there is a lot of things that a U.S. president can do as the commander-in-chief operationally. But being president is also about setting a certain tone of the nation. And so being a nation is much more than a bunch of policies or of laws. It's a moral discourse. It's a moral environment. And what we have seen under Donald Trump is how poisonous, how dangerous can be having someone in charge who injects in this moral discourse, which is one nation, hate or contempt. And so here Joe Biden has done already this, because restoring decency to the office, it's the beginning of healing, because there's no healing if it's all about divisions, us versus them, and so on. So this is something that is happening, and a man of his age and of his experience, even difficult ones, I think is a blessing in some sense for this nation.
It certainly does give us a sense of hope, at the very minimum, anyway. Massimo Faggioli, professor of theology and religious studies at Villanova University, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Also, you might want to check out his most recent book, Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States. Massimo, thank you so much for your time with us today. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. How America has lost its footing across the globe as a model of democracy and what President Biden can do to fix that. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
In corporate speak, there are no, quote, job cuts. Instead, firings are blandly referred to as employment adjustments. Now, though, corporate wordsmiths will need a whole new thesaurus of euphemisms, for masses of job cuts are coming for employees in the higher echelons of the corporate structure. Don't look now, but an unanticipated result of the ongoing pandemic is that it has given cover for CEOs to speed up the adoption of highly advanced RPAs, robotic process automation, to replace employees once assumed to be immune from displacement. As one analyst told a New York Times reporter, with RPA, you can build a bot that costs $10,000 a year and take out 2 to 4 humans. Prior to the COVID crisis, many top executives feared a public backlash if they pushed automation too far too fast. But ironically, the economic collapse caused by the pandemic has so discombobulated the workplace and diverted public attention that corporate bosses have been emboldened to rush ahead. While the nationwide shutdown of offices and furloughing of employees has caused misery for millions, one happy purveyor of RPA systems notes that it has, quote, massively raised awareness among executives about the variety of work that no longer requires human involvement. He cheerfully declares, "We think any business process can be automated," advising corporate bosses that half to two-thirds of all the tasks being done at their companies can be done by machines. This is Jim Hightower saying, conventional corporate wisdom blithely preaches that all new technologies create more jobs than they kill. But even these Pollyannish preachers are now conceding that this robotic automation of white-collar jobs is being imposed so widely, suddenly, and stealthily that losses will crush any gains. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by the Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. So grab a libation, pull up a virtual chair, and join our freewheeling conversations with political mavericks, musical agitators, and kick-ass grassroots groups. The Lowdown Happy Hour will connect you to good trouble activists who are building people power across America. Get the lowdown at hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. As President Biden shapes his foreign policy, journalist James Traub says the threats to American democracy today come more from within than outside the nation, and that restoring democracy at home will go a long way to rebuild trust in American democracy abroad. And we say hello to James Traub, journalist and scholar specializing in international affairs. He is a columnist and contributor to the website foreignpolicy.com. He is a fellow of the Center on International Cooperation and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also currently writing a book about the rise and fall of liberalism that centers on Hubert Humphrey. James Traub, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Happy to be here.
And we're happy to have you with us. You recently wrote an op-ed in the New York Times titled, "What Should Drive Biden's Foreign Policy?" You argue that the Cold War liberalism of Hubert Humphrey provides a guide for President Biden, not only in foreign policy, but also here in the U.S. So for starters, remind us what Cold War liberalism actually means.
So it referred to a group of people who were Democrats. They were liberal Democrats. They believed in an activist government. They believed in doing things about civil rights. They had all of those liberal commitments. They also were talking about the late 1940s, the early 1950s. They were strongly anti-totalitarian, which is to say that for them, they took the menace of communism quite seriously. And in their mind, there was a very important connection between these two different commitments, which is they thought we are engaged in a great struggle of ideas between two incompatible, radically different ideas. The idea of individual freedom that is at the heart of liberal democracy, and the idea of the collective that is at the heart of Soviet communism. And they said, in order to win that battle, we have to prove that our way is better than their way. And so for them, the profound connection between domestic and foreign policy was that by solving the profound problems, social problems that all states faced of prosperity and overcoming alienation and dealing with the problem of minorities, by doing that, they would also succeed in winning this Cold War, this great global ideological struggle. So for them, domestic policy and foreign policy were intimately linked to each other.
How did Hubert Humphrey express those values when in political office?
So Humphrey, most of us think of Humphrey as this kind of sad figure who was Lyndon Johnson's vice president in 1964 and was just humiliated and browbeaten, and then lost in a very painful, humiliating way in the 1968 presidential election to Richard Nixon. And he was those things. Before those things, he was the great shining liberal of the United States Senate. He had been a crusading mayor of Minneapolis right after the war, and then was elected to the Senate in 1948. And if you read Humphrey's speeches, every time he talks about an issue like civil rights, and he was a great, passionate advocate for civil rights legislation at a time when that was almost impossible because Southerners dominated the Senate, he would say the following. He would say, the world of Black and brown people is looking at us, and they are looking to see what kind of a society we are. Do we deserve their faith and loyalty? Well, how do we demonstrate that? We demonstrate that by proving that we are prepared to take on a problem like civil rights. And on almost every issue, he would reiterate this idea that we were locked in a kind of ideological struggle, and the way to win it was through acts of social justice at home.
As President Biden moves forward, you make an important point that the threats facing the United States today are very different now than at the time of Cold War liberalism first emerged. How are the threats different, and how should that shape a Biden agenda?
Well, I mean, I guess the reason why I wrote this article is because of the analogy between the two periods. So let me first talk about how they're similar, and then I'll talk about how they're different. The reason why the analogy makes sense to me is that once again, we're at a moment when democracy seems to be on its back foot, when there is a profound threat to democracy, when we see autocratic states, Russia and China above all, seeking to undermine democratic countries. But here's the great difference. Nobody really had to worry in 1950, or for that matter, 60, 70, 80, or 90, that democracy in the United States or democracy in other Western countries, all of whom have what we used to call a consolidated democracy, which is a way of saying it's on solid footing, it's not going away. We didn't have to worry that democracy was imperiled at home. Now we do. Now we do. The threat from abroad is much less great today than it was in 1950. The threat at home is much greater than it was in 1950. But in both cases, we are at a moment when we cannot take for granted the virtues of a democracy. They have to be demonstrated, and they have to be fought for abroad and at home. And so my argument is that Biden's foreign policy, which is very much centered around the idea of helping to preserve and protect endangered democracy, that once again links change at home, where we demonstrate that our democracy can solve the problems of today, like the pandemic, like stagnant economic growth, like civil rights, that is also a means of carrying out this foreign policy of democratic renewal.
In a recent piece in Foreign Policy, you ask this question about the role of the U.S. in the world. And you write that Biden believes in the legitimacy of American power. Does the rest of the world? What is your sense of the rest of the world's willingness to accept U.S. leadership, especially after the last 4 years we've had?
Yeah, Jim, I think there's actually two different questions we have to ask. One is, does the rest of the world? And the other is, do we? And so my piece actually was about both. I mean, in my piece, I said this word lead or leadership turns out to be incredibly kind of conflictual, because for many people, and now I mean at home, they say, sure, Joe Biden, he deserves to be president. He's a good guy. In what sense does America in 2021 deserve to lead the world after 4 years of Donald Trump, after every terrible thing the United States has done, after Iraq and so on? And of course, people abroad who in the past may have looked to America for leadership would now say, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And so, well, might they think, what is the underlying pattern? I mean, there was Bill Clinton, but then there was George Bush and the war in Iraq. There was Barack Obama, but then there was Donald Trump and Make America Great Again. So along comes Joe Biden and says, no, there is a steady state of American foreign policy, which is liberal and multilateral and so forth, and I'm going to bring it back. And they may turn out to say, we can't trust that. And so we will see over the ensuing several years, what is the case. But I also wanted to be saying in that piece that I understand very well why, especially people on the left, react badly, recoil at this word leadership. And I'm of an age, being 66, that I grew up in the late 60s and early 1970s during Vietnam. And I would have told you the idea of American leadership was repugnant. America didn't have the right to lead. But the history of American foreign policy is not only Vietnam. It's not only Iran. It's also the establishment of the institutions that govern the world. It's a lot of things. And the world actually needs American leadership, in part precisely because of this challenge to democracy that we were just talking about. And so for all that America may not have merited that right to lead, nevertheless, it's called to do so right now.
What would you say, James, are some of the specific issues that could benefit from U.S. leadership?
Well, Trump frittered away a lot of opportunities where, had he had a more traditional idea of America working with its allies, leading them, as I say in the piece, to some extent from alongside, it's a kind of leadership, he could have been far more successful in challenging China, for example, than he has been. If he had struck a consistent tone, he could have been far more successful in leading allies to push back against Russia. So these are both cases where America, I would have said, abdicated its leadership role in the last 4 years, and where I think Biden is very determined to take it up again. This whole question of democracy, America is just one of many democracies, but of course it's the biggest one, it's the oldest one, it's in many ways the most important one. I guess I shouldn't say it's the biggest one. India is bigger. And so at this moment, when we see illiberalism rising in democracies, obviously in our own country, but also in India, in Brazil, in Hungary, in Poland, where you would say populist illiberal leaders have taken over, but in many other Western European countries where right-wing illiberal or anti-democratic parties are gaining power, it falls to the United States, I think maybe more than any other country, though, of course, along with other countries, not to try to convert undemocratic countries to democracy, but to do whatever can be done to preserve and protect democracy where it exists and is threatened.
We're speaking to James Traub, journalist and scholar specializing in international affairs, columnist and contributor to the website foreignpolicy.com, also a fellow of the Center on International Cooperation and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And James, as President Biden seeks to restore the U.S. leadership in the world, and you make the distinction, which you started to touch on a few moments ago, that lead need not be a euphemism for dominate. Why is this an important distinction to make, and what does it look like in terms of policy? Because again, because of the last 4 years, everything's different now, and I think probably the approach is got to be different now.
So one of the reasons why this word lead is so hypersensitive is people will say, oh, you mean like Iraq? So people think the word lead, as you say, means dominate, and above all, it means military force. If lead means dominate, then of course, what's the instrument of domination? It's military force. But that needn't be so. I mean, interestingly, China's idea of leadership almost never involves military force. It involves power. It involves economic power. It involves diplomacy. But China does not use its military for that reason. Maybe as a threat, held in the background, brandished clearly, but held in the background. So the word leadership, to me, it has a moral significance. It says leadership is something that you have earned. People are prepared to follow you because they, at some level, believe in youth. And if you think about American leadership at crucial moments, I mean, the obvious one is right after World War II, when the United States basically just wanted to go home. Everybody had spent years in the Depression and World War II straining every nerve to the utmost. And then it turned out there was an unanticipated but very, very profound threat of the Soviet Union. And so to the already existing need to try to knit the world back together after 15 years of calamity was added the need to confront the Soviet Union, to contain the Soviet Union. And the United States did that through a kind of leadership that was not a matter of domination. It was clearly leadership. Nobody questioned the United States had an astonishing fraction of the world's power, perhaps more than has ever been the case before or since. The United States could have led in a much more dominating way, but it chose to work with its chief allies to create institutions, the United Nations, the World Bank, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, the IMF, which were based on rules that constrained the United States. And nobody need question. I mean, the United States was number one, and it disobeyed those rules sometimes when it was in its interest. There's no question. It was not a self-sacrificing great power. It was a great power. But it was a great power that saw that it was in its interest to lead in a particular kind of way, to create what we now call the liberal order, liberal world order. And so that's leadership in a way that makes lesser states feel like their voice is heard and they have a place. And that is the traditional American form of leadership.
Can he get that back, though, with the damage that has been done over I mean, you look at, for instance, the nuclear deal with Iran. Why would they want to go back into any sort of agreement with the United States after, they went into it, it comes, it goes away, just like that, sign of a pen?
You're right. And, Iran is a perfect example that we are not simply starting back where we were when we left off with the Democratic regime in 2016. What Donald Trump has done over those 4 years has changed the world that Joe Biden inherited. And so Iran is a great example where I think Biden is going to have to make a very difficult choice. And the difficult choice is that he's going to have to really upset some American allies in order to make the kinds of offers to the Iranians that the Iranians will accept. And what I mean by that is that Israel, the Saudis, the Emiratis, they are profoundly wary of Iran for very good reasons, and they deeply fear any kind of American entente with Iran. They will do whatever they can to break it up. And so a lot of the politics around Iran has to do with Biden and his team promising that we will not go soft on Iran. We know what a threat they are. But they mustn't be entrapped by their own rhetoric because the Iranians are in a profoundly suspicious state of mind. They have an election coming up in June where hardliners are going to be using any kind of perceived compromise with the United States as a political weapon. And so they are going to be in a place where it's very hard for them to make compromises. So there's going to be this standoff where the United States says, Iran, you have to first go back into compliance with the agreement. And Iran says, no, America, you have to first relax the sanctions. And that's going to be really hard to get around. But Biden, if he wants to reach a solution, he's going to have to maybe, take a risk on that one.
The New York Times op-ed that I mentioned earlier in our conversation, it ends on this note. Democracies have the capacity for self-renewal. How hopeful are you that we'll see that in today's America?
Well, Jim, I guess it's kind of in my nature to err on the side of hopefulness. And I've often had reason to regret that. I mean, I think I'm probably, given events of the last generation, I'm unduly hopeful. But I don't want to be bitterly right. I'd rather err on that side. So yes, I believe that the world needs and I won't say is hungry for, that's too strong. Let's just say the world needs and is prepared for American leadership. I believe the American people, not all of them, some of them are just beyond, reason. But I think the American people are desperate to return to the kind of self-respect that they enjoyed before. They don't want to cut a shameful figure in the world. And so I am hopeful. I really am.
There's nothing wrong with the glass half full. James Traub, Fellow of the Center on International Cooperation, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. James, enjoyed the conversation with you today. Would love to do it again sometime soon.
All right. It was a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press with Norm Ornstein, a longtime observer and scholar of Congress and politics, on why Biden's agenda is in peril and why reforming the filibuster is a necessary fix.
The Senate is looking at is split 50-50. Does that make it more likely or less likely they'll be able to work in a bipartisan manner?
Well, let's put it this way. If it were 50-50 with a Vice President Pence, he'd be in big trouble. That it's 50-50 has pluses and minuses. In one sense, the minds of the 50 Democratic senators are concentrated on a reality, starting with the fact that they aren't going to get any Republicans for anything significant, that they're going to have to keep all of their troops together. And it remains quite remarkable that this sweeping package, which includes things lifting half of children in poverty out of that level among them, that they were able to get everybody from Bernie Sanders to Joe Manchin to hang on, and including after, of course, the minimum wage was taken out of the package. But at the same time, you need all 50 Democrats. And even if you had 56 Democrats, 57 Democrats, so long as the filibuster rule remains in place, none of the big and important things that need to be done would get done. So that's the challenge. The challenge is the Senate, even more than it is keeping every single Democrat in the Senate together or keeping a very narrow margin in the House from falling apart.
Well, it wasn't so long ago. We remember well, they're still around, Trent Lott and Tom Daschle, able to work together. And this was, of course, what Joe Biden was known for. But I wonder, Norm, whether the days of a Joe Biden reaching across the aisle and getting things done, whether those days are gone forever, or is it possible to bring them back?
Forever is a long time.
Yes.
But in the short run, I just don't see it, with a caveat. Smaller things that don't have the great national significance, things maybe in some instances where a few of the Republicans in the Senate who are a little nervous about 2022, and they have a lot more seats up than Democrats, and at this point, 14 incumbents running for re-election, or maybe they'll be able to agree. You could imagine that on perhaps a criminal justice reform bill or a mental health policy bill, maybe even, although I'm skeptical, ultimately getting enough votes for a universal background checks bill. But on the big things and on most things, we're not going to get Republican votes. And I doubt whether there'll be more than one or two token ones when you get a nervous person who's given a green light by Mitch McConnell, knowing that it won't make any difference in the outcomes. if the basic battle is to get 60 votes, not 50 votes, and you have a Republican Party acting like a parliamentary minority, uniting in opposition to everything of significance, forget about it. And I'll tell you, Bill, in some ways, the reconciliation process that was used to get the big COVID package through is a proof of that. So, I did a thought experiment. Republicans knew that it was almost guaranteed that Joe Biden was going to have 50 Democrats in the Senate willing to vote for the $1.9 trillion package. They might make a few internal adjustments, and that Kamala Harris would be able to cast the tie-breaking vote. So if you really wanted a compromise, knowing that reality, and with a president who made it clear that his preference was to get 60 or more votes, what are you going to do? You're going to propose an alternative of, say, 1.4 trillion.
Right.
1.5 trillion. You're going to propose that maybe you cut the amount going to state and local governments from 350 billion to 200 billion, and that you alter some of the formulas. And then you'll sit down and ultimately you're going to get a compromise of around 1.7 trillion with some of the other changes. And you will have accomplished quite a lot from your own perspective. When they offered the 10 Republicans $600 billion, less than a third of what was in the Biden package, right from the get-go, it was clear this was not serious. It was for show. And if they're not going to compromise on something like that, where they actually have something to gain from it, and instead they want to criticize Biden for not really being bipartisan like he promised, and that the bill was done on a partisan basis, if that's your goal, you're going to behave the way they behaved. And we know that's the goal.
Right. So as you point out, this was a transformational piece of legislation, right? I mean, there is so much in there that we still are maybe not even aware of, but money for middle class families of $1,400, money for kids, lifting them out of poverty, money for restaurants to reopen, money for states and cities to deal with vaccine distribution, on, and yet not one Republican vote in the House or the Senate. So what lesson does Joe Biden or Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi or any of us learn from that experience?
Well, in some ways, the overall lesson is clear. The game plan that Mitch McConnell used in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, in the first 2 years after his reelection, is the game plan they're using now. And it worked back then. Right. And that is, you unite in opposition to everything, you block what you can, you delegitimize what you can't, and you delegitimize the president. And they won more seats in the House than they had in 100 years in 2010, and won the majority, and won the Senate in 2014. It defies reason that they would do anything different, that they would put the needs of the country first. So you've got that, and then it becomes a question of what tactics you use. If I'm Joe Biden, I'm going to continue to offer Republicans a seat at the table, understanding that it's not likely to work. If I'm Chuck Schumer, knowing that I need to get support from Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, Dianne Feinstein, and others who want to be sure that there is a legitimate role for the minority. On some of these issues, I am going to do robust hearings with real debate, with amendments allowed, including by Republicans, and I'll do the same thing on the floor, and let the proof be in their behavior. If we see that happening and they still all vote in unison against, it's powerful evidence sooner rather than later that we need to change the Senate rules.
Right. That gets us to the filibuster. I mean, first of all, and again, here on the Bill Press Pod today, we're talking with Norm Ornstein from the American Enterprise Institute, who knows more about the workings of the United States Congress than anybody I know, and has written a lot about it. Norm, tell us, first of all, it's important that people understand The filibuster is not in the Constitution, right? So how do we get stuck with it?
It's an interesting story in history. So there is a procedure that only the wonks understand who follow parliamentary procedure that's there in almost every legislature, and it's a motion on the previous question. If you move the previous question, that means you get a majority vote that says, yes, enough debate, we're moving on to a vote, and we'll act on whatever policy is up. The House and Senate originally both had this motion on the previous question. And then in 1805, Vice President Aaron Burr, about to leave office, not having to worry anymore about Alexander Hamilton, went to the Senate in a kind of farewell address and said, I've been the president of the Senate and I've presided over many of these sessions. And it's clear to me that your rule book, you built in a lot of stuff that's unnecessary. They're extraneous things. I've got some suggestions for how to clean up your rule book. And the members of the Senate said, okay. One of those was eliminating from the Senate rules the motion on the previous question. Nobody really thought about the consequences of doing this. For quite a while, it didn't seem to have any consequences because people didn't act as if they had any understanding of it. And then ultimately, members realize that if you don't have a way of having a majority through a motion, say, okay, that's enough debate, we're going to move to a vote. Any one or any number of senators could stand up on the floor and just keep talking and keep action from taking place. It didn't happen that often, but it happened in a very severe way in 1917 when 5 senators did a kind of tag team, staying on the floor and talking to keep the Navy from being prepared for what was soon to be America's entrance into the First World War. And Woodrow Wilson was very upset, called them a little band of willful men. And ultimately, after this went on for a very long time, the Senate changed its rules and brought in what is known as Rule 22, the filibuster rule, which at that point was intended to be able to stop the debate and move forward by saying that if 2/3 of those present and voting in the Senate went for closure, which they called from the French cloture, then you could stop the debate and move to a vote. And that was the beginning of the modern era filibuster.
And it was 2/3 at that time, right?
2/3 of those, and it's really important to note, present and voting, not present. 2/3 of the Senate.
Right. When did it change to 60?
So the change came in 1975. And there it was another interesting little bit of history involving a vice president and the presiding officer. The president of the Senate, the vice president of the United States, was Nelson Rockefeller. And Rockefeller shook the Senate when he declared from the presiding officer's chair that the Senate actually was not a continuing body, meaning that the rules just continued in place and that the only way you could change them was to overcome a filibuster, meaning 2/3 of the Senate present and voting, but that it was just like any other legislature, a new session convened, you did new rules, and they could be done by a majority. And both parties, not real happy with how that might play out, sat down and they compromised. And the compromise was to move from a threshold of 2/3 of those present and voting to 3/5 of the entire Senate. And it's important to say here, Bill, that that provision has been widely misunderstood. I don't think they understood at the time the unintended consequences of what they were going to do. And I still see it in pieces written about it that say they reduced the numbers from 2/3 to 3/5. But that's not what happened. They went from 2/3 of those present and voting to 3/5 of the entire Senate. And that shifted the burden from the minority, because if the minority didn't show up, and a much lower number could have brought cloture and moved to a vote, to the majority needing 60 of the 100 senators. And that's been the burden ever since. And while it didn't matter a whole lot in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, because the norms of the body were we don't filibuster very often and we only do it when it's of something of real national significance, that moved to Mitch McConnell when Barack Obama became president, actually even starting before that, the last 2 years of the Bush administration. But McConnell using that 60 vote threshold to filibuster everything because the majority couldn't stop it and the minority didn't have to do much of anything except say, we're going to filibuster.
And as people must understand today, it's, as you say, it's 60 votes. You don't have to talk. You don't have to stand up there or read the telephone book or whatever. And nobody has to sit there and listen. It's just a de facto, you got 60 votes. It's in.
Yeah. And, the one other change that mattered here before, and, we are old enough to remember, you and I, those storied filibusters on civil rights bills and voting rights bills by the segregationist Democrats from the South, Strom Thurmond talking for 24 hours and the like, that were done, before the rules change. But because they'd have to bring the entire Senate to a halt to go round the clock, Mike Mansfield, the majority leader who succeeded Lyndon Johnson, said, you know what, let's have a two-track system. We'll do other business while this is going on. Mm-hmm. And that made a difference in the dynamic. But the big thing was to move from the present voting standard. And just to give you a little story, I worked on change here with Al Franken when he was in the Senate. One day he said to a Republican colleague, see you on Monday. And the Republican colleague said, no, I'm not going to be here. It's just a cloture vote. I don't have to be here, but you do. And that tells another part of the story. The minority only needed one or two people around just to make sure no mischief occurred. But the majority wasn't going to get anywhere unless they could get 60 votes. And for the minority, you didn't have to go through any discomfort at all. You just said, I'm going to deny unanimous consent. You're going to have to filibuster. You're going to have to wait 2 days after I tell you this to file a cloture motion so that you can begin to have votes to try and bring about cloture and move to a vote. And then we can spend weeks on this, using up time on the floor. And then even if you do get cloture, which they did because they would use it on minor bills and some things that would even get unanimous support, they allowed 30 hours of post-cloture debate, but they didn't even have to debate that. So you could soak up all kinds of floor time, and nobody in the minority had to pay any price at all for it.
Now, as you pointed out earlier, that the fact of the filibuster does stand as perhaps the chief impediment to action that the Congress might be able to take on other important issues like infrastructure, like immigration, like voting rights, climate change, go down the list. So can the Senate change the filibuster now? And what would it take to change it or to kill it?
So we've seen two changes in the filibuster rule since that big change in 1975. The first one was when Majority Leader Harry Reid, during Obama's presidency, was basically pushed into changing the rule by Mitch McConnell, who told Reid and Obama that there was no way that Senate Republicans would let anybody serve on the D.C. Court of Appeals, the D.C. Circuit, the most important circuit that deals with presidential powers, regulatory matters, and the like, no matter how qualified, when there were multiple vacancies there, because they had a historic conservative majority, and he just wasn't going to let that change. And after months of working around that with, top flight nominees, Harry Reid finally said, I have no option but to change the rule so that it's a simple majority for judges. We'll keep it below the Supreme Court, and also for executive nominees, because the Republicans were filibustering many of those just to screw up the Obama presidency. So he went about it in a kind of interesting way. You can't just change the rules in the middle of the Senate. And if you do it in the traditional way, as I pointed out earlier, it could be filibustered. The rules change itself. So what Reid did was something that Republican parliamentary experts had come up with but never applied during the Bush presidency when they were upset with Democratic filibusters of some of the Bush judicial nominees. And that, it gets us deep into the wonky weeds, but you'd have a motion to move to a vote on an appeals court judge, and the presiding officer would say, no, we're in the middle of a filibuster. And a senator would say, well, I'll appeal the ruling of the chair. And an appeal of the ruling of the chair can succeed with a majority of votes. So they did a simple majority that said, no, actually, the threshold is not 60, but 50, 51 to be more accurate. And then when Mitch McConnell became the leader and Donald Trump became the president, or Mitch McConnell as leader when Donald Trump became president, said, we're going to use the same tactic and apply it to the Supreme Court. So it'll take a simple majority to fill vacancies on the Supreme Court, which, of course, is what has given us Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. So you can use the same way, kind of twists and turns of the parliamentary process in the Senate to make a rules change now. But the key, of course, is you're going to need enough votes, 50 at least, to overcome the ruling of the chair.
And you would agree that, at least if we listen to Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, and even Joe Biden, although he doesn't have a vote in the Senate, there are not 50 votes today to kill the filibuster, correct?
No question that moving to a threshold of 50 votes or 51 votes is for legislation simply does not have a majority support among Democrats in the Senate. Doesn't have every Democrat, which is what you need. Okay.
What are the other options? I think in one of your articles you talk about if you don't kill it, you could gut it.
Yeah. And, I actually, the headline in the Washington Post is not one I would have chosen only for tactical reasons.
Let's say reform it.
You could reform it. Yeah. Because, I've watched and read very carefully what Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, Dianne Feinstein, and others have said about why they don't want to eliminate the 60-vote threshold or the supermajority or the ability of a minority to block things. They want debate and deliberation. They want ways to encourage bipartisan support for things. So years ago, my preferred option, back when we still didn't have 50 votes to eliminate the filibuster, was to flip the numbers. Instead of saying you've got to have 60 people on the floor voting to stop debate, the majority having that hurdle to overcome, let's put the onus on the minority where it belongs. You need 41 votes to continue debate. Mm-hmm. At any time when you can't muster the 41, that's it. It's over. You move to a vote and to act. And I would couple that with a requirement, what Jeff Merkley, the senator from Oregon, has proposed for a number of years, the so-called talking filibuster, and say, you need the 41, and you got to be on the floor debating it while this issue is up, and you have to make that debate germane. In other words, you have to be talking about the thing that you are trying to stop. And that, I think, would put a pretty heavy burden on the minority. You could go round the clock. You could send them up to those lumpy cots outside the Senate floor that we remember with pictures from when Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats thwarted progress towards voting rights for African Americans. And, you're going to have to get 86 and 87-year-olds like Chuck Grassley and Jim Inhofe and Dick Shelby to be rousted out of those lumpy cots at 4 a.m. to come for a vote. And if they don't show up, then it's over for them. And while they may be able to hold on for some time, it's not clear they could hold on forever. And if the majority plays hardball, that means you're going to have to bring the business to a halt for days or weeks. But also you can schedule votes with more limited notice. You can schedule a session, which will include votes on a Monday or on a weekend, and maybe not let the minority party know until the Friday before, when they're already back home or making plans. There are ways in which you can make it very difficult for them. And to say, gee, that wouldn't be nice. I remember, as you must as well, when the Affordable Care Act was in the balance.
Oh, yeah.
And the Republicans demanded that they get all 60 of those votes. They wouldn't provide anybody as a courtesy because Robert Byrd, the 60th vote, was in bed, on his deathbed, in effect, almost literally. And Democrats, to get that 60th vote, had to take him out of a dire situation on a gurney into a wheelchair onto the Senate floor, where, shaking with anger, he shook his fist at the Republicans and said, shame, shame, shame. You can play hardball to accomplish your goals, and you can get a lot done.
I think the other thing that Senator Merkley has suggested is making an exception for one issue only, like voting rights. Is that in the cards?
And these are not mutually exclusive things, Bill. I've offered a number of alternatives that change the threshold or that just return to a present voting standard as a general matter on legislation. I think it's important that you put the burden on the minority where it belongs. But for something as critical right now as the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which are, in dire need of being passed, even as we speak in states around the country, Republican legislators and governors are implementing draconian voter suppression elements, basically just to keep Democrats and especially people of color from voting. We need to do something, not for partisan purposes, but to ensure that every eligible voter has the right to vote. And if that can't be done through normal procedures, the Constitution explicitly gives power in Article 1 to Congress to regulate the time, manner, and place of federal elections, and setting out as a separate category that should not be blocked by a minority trying to maintain its own illegitimate power, a majority threshold is perfectly reasonable in a lot of ways to do. But let's face it, the only way we're going to get that done with Manchin, Sinema, and others is to do what Manchin has asked for, which is you bring up these bills, you have robust hearings, you have an open amendment process for Democrats and Republicans alike. You do the same thing on the floor. And if that doesn't work and they continue to filibuster, then you've got to turn to a plan B.
Bill Press with Norm Ornstein. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Massimo Faggioli, James Traub, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.